home, again, it brings in the idea of nurture versus nature. Agreed. Well, looky who joined. Hi, Danya.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome to the Peloton Moms Book Club. We're so happy that you could join us.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you guys for having me. This is actually only my second Zoom book club, so I'm excited.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, we are having a very fruitful discussion about the many facets of this book. Overall, it was very well received within the group. A few were like, well, this is a little bit darker than I'm used to. Maybe wasn't in the right headspace for it right now, but we still all appreciated what you did with this story that you told. So for those that don't know, Danya, why don't you take a minute or two and introduce yourself to the group and let us know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Danya Kufaka. You read my second novel, which is called Notes on an Execution. My first one is called Girl in Snow, and it came out in 2017. I currently live in Seattle, where it's finally still light out and getting a little bit warmer. I have a really cute little dog downstairs. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll see a lot of him. What else? I work as a literary agent as well. So I do a lot of reading of mostly fiction all the time. So yeah, that's me. And I'm excited to be here to answer your questions.
Well, fantastic. So you were a literary agent and then you decided I've got a story to tell, or a story or two, since this is your second novel.
Yeah, well, it's been, a bit of a parallel journey. I've always worked in book publishing while writing. Actually, while I was writing my first novel, I was an editor at Penguin Random House. And then I came to Seattle to write my second one and sort of stumbled into agenting as a more remote friendly option. So it's definitely been a little bit of both for a very long time.
Fantastic. Well, one of the things, I had an advanced reader's copy and then I had the final edition copy, and there was a noticeable difference between the two. And I just wanted to kind of pick your brain as to why that was, because we talked a little bit about it in the book club, that the advanced reader's copy had an author's note, and you gave some perspective that I found helpful, but it wasn't in the final copy. So what was the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, that's actually just a really practical thing, which is that publishers don't put them in the final copies. So I actually asked my publisher, is there a way to put that in there? And my editor sort of said, in a final book where people are presumably paying for the hardcover or the Kindle or whatever they are, they don't like to be told how to read it. And I thought that was kind of interesting, whereas, the advanced readers editions are sent out for reviews and for like Bookstagram and things like that, where you can kind of be like, please read it this way. So yeah, I was a big fan of writing that letter, and I did want to include it in the hardcover, but it's not something that large publishers usually do.
Okay, well, that's good to know. That's why we asked the question. So I had no clue. So, one of the things that I noticed when I was reading the book, there were a lot of colors in the names and vivid color imagery throughout the book. Was there a reason for the names that you chose and the way that you chose to utilize colors? What was the story behind that?
Yes, I'm so glad you picked up on that. I've been tagged in a couple Instagram posts where people were kind of wondering the same thing. And it always makes me really happy when you pay attention to one of those really little details and then real readers in the actual world pick up on it. I've always been one for literary symbolism. I wrote a whole paper in high school about the color yellow in Crime and Punishment, which, probably I don't want to revisit as a piece of writing. But it's funny, it wasn't necessarily intentional when I started it, but once I had two characters, I had Lavender and I had Safi, and Safi was always short for Saffron. And Hazel came a little bit later, and I can tell you guys a little bit about that as well. But once I had two of the three characters that had colors for names, I was like, well, the third one needs to as well. And for me, that was important because they're all colors and they're all flowers. And both of those things are very life-affirming, life-giving, and I think stand in really important contrast to the sort of dark lifelessness of Ansel's brain and his prison cell. So it was important to me that the women were sort of given every single opportunity to be more alive than he is.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Definitely a very big contrast between the two.
Yes, definitely. And you can't see right now because I'm wearing long sleeves, but I have a big tattoo on my arm that is of lavender flower, hazel, and saffron flowers, which I love. Yeah.
Did you get that after the book or?
Oh, cool. I have one for my first book as well. I don't usually tell people that because it feels like a weird narcissistic thing, but here I am telling you.
I love it. Well, guys, I have plenty more questions, but this is a book club and I want to make sure that everybody, if you have anything that you'd like to ask Danya, please feel free to, raise your hand or come off mute, and let's try not to talk over each other. I'm going to open this up for a minute or two, see if anybody wants to chime in and not let me be the only one chatting.
Danya, I'd love to ask about his manifesto. How were you thinking about that? We didn't really get to see much of it. We heard some of the things that he was thinking about, but there was no access to the actual writing. Did you ever think about putting some of that in so that we could really get a flavor for it, or did you really want to keep it sort of illusory like that?
Great question. There actually was a draft where there were bits of it in there, and I found that they weren't really adding anything. I mean, the whole point of his manifesto is to make him believe he's smarter than he is. So putting his like faux intellectual writing in there actually didn't really add much. It just proved the point that had already been proven. So in order to just keep it as tight as possible, I took it out. But it was funny, and I never quite figured out the voice. I never quite figured out what his actual manifesto sounded like. And maybe that was part of it, was that I just never quite nailed it down. And I just sort of wanted to let it be something that belonged to him. And also by putting it in, you sort of highlight its importance, right? When kind of the point is that he's not all that smart.
Yeah, that kind of came through at first. I thought, maybe he is smart. And then as time went on, like, oh, this is just another one of those guys with big ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And actually one of the titles I thought of for the book, which didn't make a ton of sense, but I really liked it, was This Is Not a Manifesto. So we didn't end up using it, but I did really like it. Maybe I'll use it for something else.
No, I like the name you settled on much better.
Me too.
Okay, Lindsay, come on mute and come chat with Danya.
So I'm curious if you chose kind of the Tupper Lake region. Had you been there before and kind of know that it's a little run down? I mean, my husband's best man in our wedding grew up in Tupper Lake, so I've been there. I know what it's like, and I can kind of easily visualize it in the story. So I was just wondering, had you been to these places you were writing about, and that's why you chose them, or?
Yes, I've lived upstate before. My partner's family lives up there, and I lived with them for a while after college. I worked as a waitress kind of by Lake Placid, and I did some exploring around the Adirondacks area, and Tupper Lake really stood out to me. It has a really specific vibe to it, which if you've been, it is really run down. It's also very beautiful and like very historic, and it feels like it's both like full of interesting people and also has seen better days. So that was kind of interesting for me. I went to a restaurant there that was one of the only restaurants there, and I kind of, the story started unspooling in my head of this little town where it had once been so alive. There used to be a ski resort there, and sort of what happens to the people when industry and access leave the space that they're from when they live in. So yes, very familiar with Tupper Lake, and very familiar with most of the Adirondacks as well.
Okay, Jennifer Crowley, do you have anything else to add to that one?
Well, ironically, that was actually a similar question because I grew up in Lake Placid. So it was really interesting to me that you chose to kind of set it up there. I had no idea going into it that was going to be the setting. So that was super fun for me. But did you ever think of incorporating, there's also a number of prisons in that area. And did you ever give thought to him being in prison up there as opposed to Texas? I mean, I know he ultimately committed the final murder in Texas, and so obviously probably had to be in prison there, but did you give thought to that?
This is a great question because actually I had to do so many workarounds because they don't have the death penalty in New York. So actually it couldn't work there, and I had to get him somewhere else. If I had had a choice, it would have all taken place up there. But there had to be a reason for him to be in Texas. And I did a ton of research about different prisons across the country. The reason I chose prison in Huntsville is because it's actually the place where a third of the country's executions happen. So it was most important to me to sort of get that experience as close to correct as I could. So yeah, actually I had a whole long conversation with my agent about like, when does he leave New York and go to Texas, and why, and how does he get across the country? Because like, of course, mostly the book takes place, the living scenes in the book take place in New York, and the prison cell has to be in Texas. So it's a good question.
Yeah, and just to follow up to that, I have to say that was the one piece I didn't really see coming at all, that I kind of thought that I thought she had escaped, and I was like, oh good, she made it. And then boom, and I was like, kind of coming down to the end, and that one really threw me for a loop. I definitely did not see that one coming. So yeah, but it makes sense now. It all makes sense, because I was like, oh, he could have been in Dannemora. He could have been, there's so many places he could have been up there.
Right. And, I'm glad you brought up Dannemora, because I, of course, knew a lot about Dannemora, having lived upstate. I remember when it happened. I was living in New York City at the time, but, sort of going back and forth when the escape from Dannemora happened. And I, of course, watched the TV show, and the character of Shauna is really loosely based on Joyce Mitchell, who is the real woman who helped those prisoners escape.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, and that was my last thing. That seems to be very similar. Yeah,
there's one line that Joyce Mitchell says in a TV interview that I watched that really just broke my heart, that I put directly into the book. And it was, "Everyone tells me I'm too nice." And I was just like, oh, that is so devastating. So, and that ended up in the book.
I figured that the reason why you said it in Texas was for the reasons that you said, because if you can't tell by my accent, I live in Texas. I live about an hour from Huntsville, so I'm very familiar with all the things that my great state has to offer, positively and negatively. But moving on, Erga, do you have anything you want to come off mute and ask Danya about?
Yes, and I'm 3 minutes from Jennifer. So, all right. So I apologize. I read the book a little while ago. I can't remember the names of the twins, but I was wondering if there were some sort of parallels between Ansel and the girlfriend twin, because when we were looking at the twins, from the outside, there's I don't want to say loser twin, but one that is kind of like down on her luck, and the other one is lively, full of life. But in reality, it seems like that girlfriend twin has a lot of insecurities, but is also full of herself, kind of like Ansel, who is an insecure person, but tries to make it look like he is some hot stuff. Am I just seeing stuff, or were there parallels there?
Yeah, absolutely. And with the twins, Hazel and Jenny, Jenny ends up marrying Ansel, and then he ends up killing her. With the twin storyline, I really wanted to explore sisterhood and explore how, jealousy and envy and love intertwine and are able to sort of flip-flop over a span of many decades, right? Like there are moments where Hazel's down on her luck and, sort of flailing, and Jenny seems to have it all, and she's confident, and she and Ansel, have this sexy courtship that Hazel wants, but then decades later it flips, and Jenny's the one who's down on her luck, and then Jenny's the one who has to pick herself up off the ground. And I think that definitely goes in parallel with Ansel's journey himself. And I think that's a good point. I mean, no one's ever brought that up. I do think, sometimes I don't want to liken it to people who peak in high school, but maybe there is something along those lines, right? Like both Jenny and Ansel have sort of like a power when they're young that they don't have later in life. And that I think is because of, the choices we make. Obviously the two of them made very different choices from each other. And I do think before Jenny is killed, she's getting herself back together and really finding power for herself.
Oh, great. That makes sense. And I didn't even think about that. So thank you for the question. Jennifer Kinney, you want to come off mute and come talk to Danya?
Sure. My question is, did you want the reader, did you research and watch any documentaries about serial killers in writing this book? Because I watched one a long time ago about Aileen Wuornos, I think her name is. And the feeling I had from when I watched that was kind of the feeling I had when I read this book. While I didn't feel bad, or like where I like Ansel isn't a character that, it's not about him, but I felt like society was sort of responsible for him in some ways.
Yeah, I watched a ton of documentaries about serial killers, but the thing that actually prompted me to write this book in a lot of ways was having watched those documentaries just as a person who wanted to watch those documentaries, not as a person who was doing research, and really asking myself, like, why am I so interested in this? Like, why do I care about killers so much? Why does everybody, like, why are, if you have the version of the book that has my letter to the reader in it, it asks, like, why are we so obsessed with these men who do bad things? Like, what is it about them that makes us retell their stories in the same way over and over and over again? And part of writing the book was an attempt to answer that question, or to ask that question, really, not to answer it. I don't think anyone can ever fully answer it. But I guess to like interrogate the idea that like we're all kind of, like you said, we're all kind of culpable in this fascination, or we're all kind of culpable in making someone like him so compelling, when really he's just a sad, bad guy.
I wonder if it's also, sorry, cutting in. I was going to say, I wonder if it's also because of our nature as women and moms. A lot of times we want to solve problems. So we're looking at these very problematic situations and constantly thinking what we would have done to fix it, type of thing.
Totally.
Anna, you want to come off mute and ask Danya something?
Yeah, so you had mentioned that you wanted it to be in Texas for just that's where executions take place. But did you like tour any facilities or anything to get that information? It was very detailed for like what it was.
That's a great question. I did not tour any facilities. Generally, prisons don't like for you to go and look around. I think for the most part, you need to have a reason to be there. You need to have somebody you're going to see, which I did not. And I was pretty against the idea of contacting any prisoners directly, just because I think there's a lot of power dynamics there that I wasn't wanting to enter into. But what I did do was I hired a research assistant. He did a wonderful job. He lived in the Houston area, and I found him through PhD program in sociology, where I'd sort of emailed the head of the department and said, does anyone want to help me with my novel? And I paid him to find out everything he could about this prison from a local standpoint. So he found a bunch of ex-correctional officers. He talked to a bunch of judges and lawyers who'd been there. He was, scouring websites for a bunch of prisoners. There are a couple prisoners whose stories were really very, very sad, who were on death row and had been posting just every day about their daily life in this place. And he compiled all of that information for me and was able to sort of synthesize it in a way that I could describe. I think everything in there is pretty much as accurate as possible. And it was really important to me, especially once the book sold to a publisher and I knew it was actually going to come out, that like those pieces of information were as close to real as they could get.
Yeah, no, I felt like I was there, and I've never visited a prison either. So
yeah, there's a lot of like YouTube too on specifically on this prison in Huntsville, just because it's so big, and it's where so many of the executions do take place, that I was able to see inside like floor plans, YouTube videos, things like that, just like some pictures, which was helpful.
And then another question I had was, so I had an advanced copy as well. So I was able to read your author's note. But with that, while I was reading it, I was more aware of catching myself sympathizing with him. And so like, was it like intentional to make him kind of a sympathetic character, but not like too sympathetic? Like how did you like decide like how sympathetic we should be kind of thing?
That was really my purpose for writing this book, and the challenge for me and the challenge for the reader too, is to sort of ask you, can you accept that this person is a human? and also not let him off the hook for what he did. And those two things together were so important to me as I was writing this book. I actually had, so there's an epigraph in the very front of the book. It's by a visual artist named Jenny Holzer. And it's a piece of art that is text, and it says, "I'm awake in the place where women die." And that epigraph did make it into the book, but it used to be paired with another epigraph. Yep, there it is. It used to be paired with another epigraph that I, for obvious reasons, when I tell you the story, could not get permissions for. And the two used to be sitting side by side. And the second epigraph was a quote from a blog from a prisoner on San Quentin death row who had said, it was, "I must remind you, the world is only as deep as we are." And I sort of had this dichotomy in my head, right? Like, how much can you acknowledge someone's humanity without redeeming them? Because, you know, serial killers are people. There's no way around it. They have stories, they have lives beyond the horrible choices they've made. And I wanted to acknowledge that as well as put him on the hook for what he's done. So yeah, I wouldn't go with sympathy necessarily for him, but I would go with humanity.
Completely agree. Yeah, and I loved it. So thank you very much.
So I'm going to wait for other people to raise their hands. So I think we talked a lot about the way that you chose to write this story from not the victim's perspective, but these other women. And I've seen a few people that wanted more from the victims, and why you chose primarily to tell the story the way you did. Just expand upon that a little bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the victims are an incredibly important part of the story of a killer. But I was more interested in telling just the things we don't see beyond the victims, right? Like, in many ways, the three women who tell this story are also victims of his. They just are alive. And I think that is an important aspect that we don't usually see in fiction or in this narrative about killers. I did want to give some perspective to the victims, which is why I have the epilogue in there, and why I focused a lot in specifically Safi's chapters on having her remember these girls and women for the people they could have been, right? And I think none of the characters actually know who the girls really were. And that's kind of beside the point of the book in some ways. You know, I think the victims are incredibly important. They always are, but I was interested in reaching just one step further.
Mm-hmm. And so, speaking to Lavender in particular, we talked a lot about, you know, her initial decision and why she did the things that she did. And then over the course of her life, why she didn't do more to maybe reach out to them. So from your author's perspective, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think trauma's a bitch, excuse me. But I do think it's true, right? I think when you go through an ordeal like that, I mean, I wouldn't know from personal experience, but I do imagine when you go through an ordeal like that and you have to go to such incredibly drastic measures just to stay alive, it's not something you're really looking to revisit. And for me, that was part of Lavender's journey, was the point where she reaches enough healing to be able to even look a little bit back at what she left behind. And, you know, of course, she doesn't like what she sees. It's devastating what she sees. And that sort of proves her point in the end, right? That all you can do is move forward. So for me, it was difficult to balance that line of how much she can handle and how much Lavender felt so real to me, even from the very beginning. And it was interesting. I wrote her first really sad chapter very, very early on in the process. And when I discovered that the women will be recurring characters, her next spaces in life just came to me as though they already existed. Like, there was no question for me of where she would end up or who she would be. She just was there, which did not happen with the other two characters. The other two I had to like really, really sort of finagle. So yeah, I love Lavender.
And another thing that we discussed briefly was the scenes between him and the prison guard. And I don't know if you did this intentionally, but, you know, like, I was sitting there reading it and I was like, well, man, he really seems pretty confident that he's about to bust out of this. And I'm like, well, then the name of this book is Notes on Execution. Is he literally about to just make this escape happen? So, I mean, you had me going to a certain extent. I was legitimately entertaining this idea of a prison break. So was that your goal? And
yeah.
do you think that the prison guard, and I know she was such a two-bit character, but do you think that she was playing him the whole time, or did she just get cold feet at the end, or did you have any thoughts on that?
She always struck me as someone who didn't quite know what she wanted. And I think since we only ever see her through his perspective, we don't quite understand her. I do think she has obviously more power than she knows, which is why she goes through this whole process with him, is to get that power, to feel powerful for someone who doesn't often feel powerful. For me, the concept of his considering and believing that he's going to break out of prison was very much about character development. Like I sat down to write this book and I was like, this guy cannot know he's going to die. He cannot believe he's going to die. And there has to be a turning point where he realizes that he's going to die. And that made it just more interesting to write. That made his, like, you know, the last 12 hours of his psyche much, much more, I guess, like fertile for me. It felt like I could just grow more story out of it that way. And it felt more suspenseful. So for me, it was very much a plot device. I'm glad you liked it.
I did. And I think another part of the book that jumped out to a lot of people was discovering that his brother did survive and that he was mistaken in his comprehension of the verbiage he was told when he was 4. That was a big shocker moment to me. And then we get Blue because of it, which was another interesting perspective, and her thoughts on attending the execution at the end. So, I mean, can you just expand upon Blue a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I have a really funny fact about Blue, which is that when I first wrote this book, half of it was told from Blue's perspective, and now she's not even there anymore. She was not particularly interesting, and she didn't fit into the structure of the book as I eventually landed on it. But Blue for me is, someone once phrased it as she's the last person who could have loved him. And I really liked that. I think she's sort of his last chance at saving himself, and he chooses not to. And I think in attending the execution, she is acknowledging that fact. And I think there's a point where she says something like, you know, bad people are people too, which was a very unsubtle way of saying what I just said, which is that, like, you know, I don't say this on media because I don't want to get quoted on it, but serial killers are people. They are living humans. And I think Blue exists to remind us of that, and to remind Ansel of that too, that, you know, there was a point where he could have made a different choice. And that was sort of his last one.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Sappy, I mean, you know, when Sappy said what she said to him, and it kind of served as his catalyst to pull the trigger and make his way down to Texas, I just felt like, did you have to say that? I mean, there's just a lot to unpack there in that one action, and then the reactions that kind of ripple out from it.
Yeah, you know, I mean, they come from the same place. And what was so interesting to me about Sappy was she goes through all the same traumas that Ansel goes through, such similar devastations at a young age. She lives in the same house. She loses her parents. She has all these identity crises, yet she does not kill people. Only Ansel kills people. And I think that that parallel for me, that's the point where she says those things to him and he makes that choice again, is where he flips into something different, right? I mean, he always has flipped into something different when he decides to kill people. But I think that moment is where you can definitively say, no, this is a choice that you're making, not like, oh, my trauma made me do it, or my backstory made me do it, or whatever. No, you made that choice. There's other people who lived your life and did not make that choice. So that was the intent there for me.
Okay. Carrie, I see your hands up. Come off and say hi to Danya.
Hi, Donnie. Thank you so much for being here with us. I adored the book, gave it all the stars I could give it when I reviewed it online. It was just wonderful. But where I'm stuck is how to describe it. When someone asks me, you know, what genre does this fill? Or, you know, is it gory? Is it sad? Is it a thriller? Is it a coming of age? Yes, it's all of that. What category do you put it in?
Truly same. I don't know. I work as a literary agent. I work with a publishing team, and positioning is really everything. And I think it's important in the positioning of this book. And I think they succeeded in the positioning of this book. It's very clear that it's not a thriller. And it's very clear that you're not going to get like that murder mystery from it, right? It's something a little bit different. I personally refer to it as crime fiction, literary crime fiction, which like, you know, sort of suggests something kind of murdery, but it's not a murder mystery, right? And that's, if that's helpful in talking about it, that's how I kind of talk about it. But, you know, I do tell people it's really heavy. It's really dark, obviously.
I'm sorry, baby. Mama's not done yet.
Oh, my bud. So yeah, I like to warn people that it's really dark and really sad, really heavy. But you know, I hope it moves you. That's kind of what I've been saying. Instead of like hope you like it, it's more like, you know, I hope it moves you. Because liking it is not really the point.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there when you going back to liking it, because it was one of the things that we talked about was it feels weird to say that you like this book.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure. For sure. I mean, I felt weird like giving it to my whole family and being like, look what I did. This is really sad. So yeah, I totally feel you. I imagine it's kind of weird to hand it to your friends and be like, this is something that's like pretty messed up in a lot of ways, but like will make you think is kind of what I'm aiming for.
Can I ask a quick second question? What is your first book about? How does it compare to this?
So my first book is much more classic, like whodunit. It's, let me see, I think I have a copy here. This is my first book, Girl in Snow. And this one has, you know, a dead body at the beginning, and at the end you find out who did it. And, you know, I like to think it does a little more than that too. It plays a lot with genre. It plays a lot with, most of the characters are teenagers. I started writing it when I was 19. So I think that's kind of how that evolved. But this one definitely felt more ambitious for me and definitely felt like the space I wanted to be working in.
all right, Erg, you got another question?
Yes. Okay. So, so that genre thing has been happening quite a bit lately in a lot of books. So maybe that's going to be a genre of its own these days. But I was waiting for the pretty pink bow at the end, which was going to be him laying on the gurney, turning his head, seeing Blue wearing the dang locket. He never saw the locket. It was like a bite I couldn't swallow. Why did he not see the locket?
I think that would have, like you said, it would have been too clean. Life isn't that clean. Life isn't that pretty. You know, things end kind of brutally sometimes. And I think the locket functioned also for Lavender. And that was really important for me, that Lavender has that moment where she knows she's sort of sending it back to him rather than for him to have that moment. So for me, it functioned for her rather than for him. But yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
All right. Does anybody else have any other questions for Danya? We're going to start to wrap things up, but I want to make sure that if you've got one, that we get it answered for you. So don't be shy. And if you don't want to come off of microphone, then please feel free to type it into the chat.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah.
So I always like to ask this of readers because I get such different answers, which the question is, did you want him to die? Did you want him to be saved? How did you feel about him actually dying in the end?
I'll go first. I don't like execution, period. I didn't want him to die, but I didn't want him to run away either. Mm-hmm. But in the context of the book, knowing he's in Huntsville, you know, I would prefer the death than him running away.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted him dead. I liked it. I didn't want a happy ending. I didn't want anything. It would have been out of character or out of tone with the book. I thought it was an excellent ending.
I thought I was happy that he died. I thought it was the right ending, but I also think I felt his humanity a little more than you may have. I don't know. I felt his humanity a little more than I think you may have wanted. I don't know. I felt for him, but also recognized how terrible he was.
That was my intention in many ways, and I'm glad it came through.
I think when he killed Jenny, it tipped him over the edge. That's when he deserved to die. For you know, prior to that, I think for the girls, when he was, you know, still an adolescent and obviously had come from a really tough background, you empathized with him a little bit more, and perhaps empathized, and maybe he deserved to be in prison, but maybe not death. And I think everybody has an opinion about that, but the Jenny action for me, particularly, it was his wife. I mean, and he went down there and did that. That was like, okay, he deserves what he's getting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree with Carrie, that I was happy he died. But then at the same time, during the transport, I started rooting for him in my head, and I was like, "What are you doing? We want him to die," and so I had to like switch back. But yeah, no, I appreciated the ending for what it was. Not that I just want everybody to die, but like for him, it was appropriate.
I also thought it was appropriate, considering we know he did it. Like, it's not like there was a question of if he was guilty or not. And so in that situation, like, his murders were premeditated. It's not like he just randomly decided. He drove across the country, or he watched the girl and like made the plan. It's just, there's no question of his guilt. So the circle came round.
Did you have drafts of him not dying? Never.
No, he was always going to die. Yeah. I think I also really wanted to talk about sort of how pointless executions are at the same time, right? Like, he needs to be punished, I guess the question for me is like, what do you do with bad men, right? It's not a question of should we be executing innocent people, because obviously we shouldn't, but should we be executing guilty ones? I think that is really the question I was asking. And I, having done so much research about the system that executes them, I came down on a pretty clear no. Part of me thinks it's, greater punishment to have him wither away without a voice, without a face in prison. And there are a couple moments where it says that. So I'm always curious to hear readers' thoughts on that. So thank you guys.
Kim said, I was sad when he wasn't able to pull off his escape. In real life, I wouldn't want that, but I was so caught up in the book and feeling for his humanity, I really did sort of want him to escape.
Yeah, good. I love those dualities, right? The knowing you feel for somebody and want them to get the thing that they want, while also recognizing that they're a bad person. That's like my favorite thing, obviously.
I was waiting for him to escape and kill the guard.
All right, I don't see anybody else coming off mute. So Danya, are you working on anything right now? And if you are, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm working on a third novel now. I kind of have no idea where it's going. I think it's going to be very different from this one. Right now, some of it is set in a virtual reality, which is new and interesting for me, and been having a lot of fun doing the research on that. So I think about climate change, about tech a little bit, also murder, of course. So yeah, it's so far even more ambitious than this one. So I'll see you guys in like maybe 10 years.
Emily said the only time I felt bad for him was seeing how loving he was with Lou. Otherwise, he was always a villain to me. I mean, we talked about this a little bit before you came on, the whole concept of serial killers, like going dormant and then coming back. And like when they're dormant, they are probably somebody's husband. They're definitely somebody's neighbor. And clearly nobody else is able to pick up on it. And so it was interesting. Mary said, I appreciate that you asked the question, what do we do with bad men? Because so often violence is talked about as a human failing when we know that it is far more often than not a male failing.
100%. Someone asked me in an interview recently whether this book would have worked if it was a female serial killer. And I said, oh, absolutely not. Nobody would give her nearly this much attention if it was a female serial killer. Also, women don't kill like that. Women kill in many different ways, but not like this. And this is such a uniquely American male story. So yeah, totally agree.
Well, we always like to end our chats by asking our guest, what are you currently reading and loving, and maybe that we should check out also? What would you like to put on our radar?
Yeah, there's two books, one that's out and one that's not. first one that is out is called Wahala by Nikki May. And it's super fun. I think her publisher was comping it to like Nigerian British Sex in the City. I listened to it on audio and I thought it was, oh, yep, you've got it. All right. Well, have you guys already read it? Okay, good. It's really, really good. And there's another book that's coming out in, I believe, June. So you might have to wait a little bit for it, but it's called More Than You'll Ever Know by Katie Gutierrez. And it's about a woman who lives a double life in Texas and in Mexico. She's married to different men in both places and has separate families in both places. So, you know, you hear about men doing that, like having a secret second family, but this is based on a true story of a woman who did it. It's really good. It's called More Than You'll Ever Know.
All right, fantastic. We will definitely put out your recommendations to the group and get it on people's radars and give some pre-order links for that second one. And yes, I have Wahala on my to be read list. So hopefully I can get to that soon. But I do see some people have already read it and they did like it. So, well, Danya, we really, really appreciate you taking the time to come and chat with us tonight. We loved the book. There was so much to discuss and we really can't wait to see what you do next. And we are wishing you much continued success with this one and good luck with the next one.
Thank you all so much for reading and for asking such great questions. It was great to be here. All right, have a wonderful night. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.